Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really taking on something pretty monumental in its ambition.
It's a big one.
It is. We're not just here to talk about a new piece of AI. We're trying to validate what feels like a really radical idea.
Which is?
That the foundational ethical principles, the ones you need for a stable, peaceful international diplomacy, are actually the very same principles you need to govern global health. Especially now, in this age of pandemics and just political fragmentation everywhere.
And that's our starting point. The sources we're looking at today really guide us on this, I think, profound intellectual journey. We start with diplomatic ethics, ideas pulled from India's approach to global affairs, the work of people like Vidya Shankar, and we connect them directly.
Directly to what, then?
Directly to the architecture of Dr. Maya GPT, which is this cutting-edge digital system designed to fight what might be the next great threat. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR.
Right. So the mission for us today is clear. We're going to analyze how Ahimsa, this ancient principle of nonviolence, how that has to be the bedrock for a truly unified, non-aligned, global framework.
Yeah, and this is a deep dive that, it literally spans millennia.
Yeah.
We're going from metaphysical concepts, like human beings being made of simple atoms and vibrations,
All the way through the complexities of Cold War diplomacy and then landing right on the challenges we face today. AI, triage protocols, global health surveillance, all of it.
And the reason we have to make this connection is because we're in a crisis. The world is just suffering from this chasm of disparity in healthcare. And at the same time, deep political fragmentation and maybe the most dangerous part, this widespread fear.
A fear that's being actively weaponized.
Actively. Traditional institutions, they often fail that basic mandate to do no harm. Sometimes they even become these structures that generate, and this phrase is from the material, passive income from people's anxiety and their medical dependency.
So, okay, the source material is basically demanding a philosophical audit. We need to establish that the blueprint for peaceful international cooperation is actually identical to the blueprint for securing our personal health and global safety.
And we need to unpack how a non-aligned AI system, something that operates outside of politics, can finally realize the kind of ethical foreign policy that, frankly, human governments have historically failed to maintain.
All right, let's get into it. Let's unpack this, starting with that philosophical foundation. The source material roots it so deeply in ahimsa, or nonviolence. In the context we're talking about medicine, global diplomacy, what does ahimsa really mean as an ethical core?
Well, it's so much more than just physical non-aggression. It's the absolute mandate to avoid harm in thought, word, and deed. That's the key.
It's in everything.
In everything. Applied to governance, it demands systems that protect the sovereignty and the integrity of every single participant. And when you apply it to medicine, it becomes the highest ethical standard there is. Do no harm and protect humanity.
And the critique in the sources is that this principle is being systematically betrayed.
Massively. The idea that the very act of seeking care can result in financial, physical, or even psychological harm. That is the ultimate betrayal of ahimsa.
You mentioned that phrase, passive income. That sounds so cynical but powerful. How does something like overtesting or overprescribing, which we know happens all the time, how does that become passive income that violates ahimsa?
It's the monetization of dependency and fear. It's as simple as that. Think about defensive medicine.
Right.
A doctor orders a whole battery of redundant tests, or they prescribe treatments that aren't strictly necessary, not because the patient actually needs them, but to protect themselves from a potential lawsuit down the road.
So it's about the doctor's liability, not the patient's health.
Exactly. And every single one of those tests generates revenue for the hospital, for the lab. This often indirectly benefits the doctor who prescribed them, maybe through incentives or just the sheer volume of business they bring in.
So the system itself thrives on the patient being anxious and, frankly, ignorant.
It does. By creating this dependency on external procedures and by actively discouraging you from relying on your body's own incredible innate power to heal, the system guarantees a steady stream of passive income. It transforms a moral duty into a profit engine. And that systemic failure, it brings us to our knees.
And the fuel for this whole engine is fear. The sources are so explicit about this, they call it the only emotion we have to conquer. Why is fear so uniquely destructive, both in our health and in diplomacy?
Fear is managed by the amygdala. It's that immediate, overwhelming emotional reaction. And its evolutionary role is simple, right? It's to prompt survival behavior. Don't touch the fire. Run from the predator.
But modern life has weaponized it.
Completely. In health, it's the fear of complication, the fear of death, the fear of infecting your family. That triggers catastrophic thinking, and it leads people to, you know, impulsively demand antibiotics for a virus or rush to the emergency room for something minor.
And diplomatic.
Diplomatically, it's the fear of exclusion, the fear of domination. That's what drives the formation of geopolitical blocs, military buildups. In both cases, it prevents people and entire nations from acting wisely. They just react.
Yeah, you see it all the time. The moment someone gets a little cough or a fever, they skip wisdom entirely and jump straight to panic. This directly violates what the sources call the 4 pillars of existence. Can you walk us through those pillars and how this fear-based medical system transgresses them?
Of course. So the pillars are, first, never surrender your free will. Second, self-love. Third, respect for other souls. And fourth, trust your soul.
Okay.
So think about it. If a doctor or an institution uses the threat of death or some severe illness to mandate a certain course of treatment, they are, in effect, compelling you to surrender your free will.
You're not choosing anymore, you're complying out of fear.
Precisely. And if that same system dismisses your intuition or your emotional distress about a symptom, it's violating self-love and trust your soul. This whole model of care, where the external authority is supreme and the patient is just this passive recipient, it's inherently unethical. It reinforces dependency and it just erodes your personal sovereignty.
So let's take this ethical framework, this idea inspired by Ahimsa, and move it into the world of international relations, specifically through the lens of anti-colonialism, non-alignment, and sovereignty. The sources use India's post-independence foreign policy as a kind of case study.
Yeah, and it's a perfect one. The sources draw a really clear parallel between an individual's right to self-determination and a nation's sovereignty. In international law, sovereignty is a nation's absolute right to determine its own course. It can choose to enter into collective decision-making, but that choice has to be made freely.
Which is where non-alignment comes in.
Exactly. India's early commitment to non-alignment was really a practical application of Ahimsa on the global stage. It was a conscious, deliberate decision to resist being dominated by either the American or the Soviet blocs during the Cold War.
And non-alignment wasn't just, being neutral for the sake of it, right? It was a moral stance.
Oh, absolutely. It was a commitment to maintaining ethical autonomy. India, through figures like Vidya Shankar, actively sought to be a bridge builder. By refusing to align with either superpower, it retained the moral authority to critique both sides and to facilitate dialogue. It was about harmonizing policy without ever sacrificing its own core interests or values.
That concept feels incredibly relevant today, especially for developing countries who are, I think rightly, very cautious about some of these global systems.
They are. They fear that sharing data, for example, could lead to exclusion, trade, and travel restrictions. It's a kind of modern digital or health-related colonialism.
And that fear of exclusion, it just reinforces the need for structures that are truly equitable and non-aligned. You see this fragility in our current international structures, right? Like the WHO seems to be constantly trying to negotiate this balance.
Constantly. I mean, take vaccine distribution during a pandemic. The WHO advocates for universal access. That's a clear necessity for global health security. It embodies that principle of respect for other souls.
Right.
But the WHO is structurally dependent on its donor states, and those donor states are often the very nations that prevent universal access by hoarding supplies or demanding intellectual property concessions. It creates this impossible paradox.
So the technical advice, which is based on what the whole world needs, gets undermined by political and financial self-interest.
Every time. It's a complete violation of the non-alignment principle.
This tension, it brings us to the messy reality of administrative structures. To handle global health, you need these layered administrative decision systems. But even wealthy, developed nations really struggle with this. Let's talk about the European decentralization examples mentioned. Norway, Italy, Sweden. Why do their struggles with this matter for a global AI system?
They matter so much because they demonstrate that human political structures inherently introduce friction and inequality. It's almost built in. Look at Norway. They initially decentralized hospital ownership to local municipalities.
Giving power to the local level. Sounds good.
In theory. But then they had to re-centralize it because they found that the local political bodies often lacked the specific expertise or, frankly, the financial capacity to manage complex health systems effectively.
Okay, so they swung back. What about Italy?
Italy did the opposite. They decentralized, creating these autonomous local health enterprises. The point is, there's this constant negotiation, this pendulum swing between central control, which gives you efficiency and standardization, and local responsiveness, which is supposed to give you equity and cater to patient needs.
And the conclusion is that finding the right balance is nearly impossible when human power and money are the primary
It
drivers.
seems to be. If human-run systems are constantly oscillating between these two poles and undermining their own stability, it really points to the need for a mechanism that can standardize protocol without imposing political control.
And that's where financial realities come in, right? The drive for innovation here wasn't just some lofty ideal.
Not at all. The initial innovations in this space, like the development of the Pediatric Assessment Tool, or PAR-PIODA, they were motivated by a deeply practical financial necessity. They needed to alleviate the staggering expenses of consultations, diagnostic tests, and to reduce unnecessary hospitalizations.
It's about efficiently using scarce resources, money, time, hospital beds.
Yes, and that is a necessary practical application of Ahimsa. It's ensuring that care is available and affordable to everyone, especially the underprivileged, who always suffer the most from this chasm of disparity.
What's so fascinating to me is how we get there. This high moral ideal of nonviolence leads you directly to the hyper-practical necessity of efficient resource management.
The connection is just undeniable. The whole foundational philosophy demands systems that are rooted in avoiding harm, in self-determination, and in a kind of coordination that operates above purely national, political, or financial self-interest. This moral framework, which we've pulled from diplomatic ethics, is the absolute prerequisite for any truly effective, non-aligned global health mechanism.
Okay, so let's take these diplomatic concepts, ahimsa, non-alignment, sovereignty, and let's really stretch them out now. How do we extend them so they become universal principles that can govern all kinds of human systems, especially health? How does ahimsa go from being a geopolitical standard to a direct health standard?
Ahimsa translates directly into the removal of fear and the promotion of psychological integrity. A health governance system that's truly founded on ahimsa has to, first and foremost, neutralize that instant, overwhelming emotional reaction of the amygdala to the idea of infection.
That panic response we talked about.
Exactly. When symptoms first appear, your mind immediately jumps to superbug, deadly virus, pandemic.
Yeah.
That is the mental harm that must be prevented. The system's first job is to interrupt that fear-driven cycle by reframing the narrative with objective, evidence-based information that empowers you, the individual, to stabilize your own emotional state.
So the system basically acts as a shield against panic. It lets the individual act wisely, not react impulsively, because that panic is what leads to all those exploitative situations we discussed earlier.
It's the gateway to exploitation. If you are paralyzed by anxiety, you are so vulnerable to online scams, to spiritual exploitation that might blame your karma, or just being coerced into unnecessary, very expensive medical procedures. Removing that fear is the first critical step towards self-healing and personal sovereignty.
And that idea of sovereignty flows so naturally into non-alignment and universal health equity. If a nation should be non-aligned and independent of political blocs, how does that same principle translate to an individual person's access to healthcare?
It means access must be based purely on need, not on your capacity to pay. Capacity to pay is the ultimate form of political and financial alignment, right? Your wealth dictates your outcome.
Which is the reality in much of the world.
It is. We have to address the persistent disparities that just plague healthcare everywhere. I mean, research from India, Latin America, even high-income regions in Europe, it all confirms the same thing. Access, quality of care, and your health outcomes are fundamentally unequal across socioeconomic, racial, and geographic lines. Consistently, Black, Hispanic, and indigenous populations face worse access compared to non-Hispanic white populations pretty much everywhere.
So a system that's based on non-alignment would have to have a universal standard that just bypasses those barriers by design. It would have to treat every human as an equally sovereign entity.
That is the key. That is the localized application of sovereignty and equity. It means true patient empowerment, requires high health literacy, it requires self-efficacy, and the ability to take initiative.
So the patient becomes an equal and engaged member of their own care team.
An equal and engaged member. It's the ultimate form of self-determination. You decide your path forward based on objective knowledge, not on fear or coercion from an external authority.
This sounds an awful lot like that diplomatic concept of bridge building, but applied internally. It's like you're coordinating the patient's own intuition with the system's objective guidance. And then we have to scale that coordination up globally through surveillance networks.
The need for international coordination and data sharing is just.
Mhm.
It's undeniable when you're facing cross-border threats.
Yeah.
We have to look at systems like WHO GLASS, that's the Global Antimicrobial Resistance and Use Surveillance System, and let's be specific about its growth.
Okay.
GLASS expanded from just 25 participating countries when it started in 2015 to 104 countries by 2023.
Wow. So why is that rapid expansion, getting all those nations on board, so critical in validating this diplomatic principle of bridge building?
Because antimicrobial resistance respects no borders. A superbug doesn't need a passport. The expansion of JLAS proves that even politically fragmented nations recognize that when it comes to survival, coordination is mandatory.
It's not optional.
It's not. Sharing data on emerging resistance patterns allows treatment guidelines to be tailored to regional realities in real time. If a specific strain of superbug suddenly becomes resistant to a first-line antibiotic in Southeast Asia, every other country on the planet needs to know that information immediately. This data-driven coordination, where political and financial interests have to take a backseat to shared survival, that's the most practical validation of harmony you could ask for.
So, to sum this part up, these core principles, ahimsa, non-alignment, sovereignty, they validate the need for a system that is designed from the ground up to manage fear, to enable self-healing, and to ensure that no individual is ever harmed financially, physically, or mentally. The ancient philosophical ideals have now become practical necessities for our species to survive.
That's it exactly.
Which brings us to Dr. Maya GPT. This is positioned as the practical realization of all these deep ethical and diplomatic ideals. It's presented as a system designed specifically to combat the AMR pandemic threat, and it's trying to move away from that sort of black box opacity of so many other AI algorithms. What is the fundamental mechanism that allows it to bypass all that political and financial friction we've been talking about?
I think its power really lies in its structured transparency and its accessibility. Dr. Maya GPT uses a very simple, color-coded system for symptom analysis that effectively serves as a universal language. It doesn't matter what language you speak, you can understand red, green, yellow.
Right.
It's designed to be universally accessible on any mobile platform, so it bypasses the need for high-cost infrastructure. And the founders' motivation is interesting here. They apparently anticipated the AMR threat not just through academic research, but through deep intuition and nightmares about the systemic failures of modern medicine to cope with cross-border pathogens.
Okay, so let's really drill down into how Dr. Maya GPT operationalizes a concept as big as ahimsa. How does an AI system actually ensure the avoidance of physical and mental harm?
Okay, so let's break it down. First, physical harm. By detecting illness early and providing very specific, standardized behavioral guidance, it prevents conditions from worsening. And crucially, it prevents the unnecessary use of antibiotics, which is what fuels resistance in the first place.
And the mental harm part, that seems harder.
It's actually the most critical part. The system avoids causing anxiety by minimizing ambiguity. It does not use complex medical jargon. It doesn't deliver terrifying probabilistic predictions like, there's a 15% chance this is something deadly.
Which just sends you into a tailspin.
Exactly. Instead, it focuses on practical, actionable steps. It reframes a potentially fear-inducing symptom into an objective, color-coded status that requires a specific, calm action.
That feels like a direct answer to the ethical failings of that kind of ego-driven, doctor-centered care we were discussing earlier.
It is. It's designed to be. Dr. Maya GPT is programmed to fulfill the do no harm duty by rebuilding trust. Remember that specific protocol for the sources about what a doctor should not do.
Yes, not to dismiss or mock a patient's concerns.
Exactly. Phrases like, oh, it's just in your head, or there's nothing actually wrong with you. Those phrases inflict real emotional trauma. They destroy the trust that is absolutely necessary for any true healing to occur. The AI, because it's impartial and non-judgmental, it just bypasses that human, ego-driven failure point. It provides validation and guidance without any emotional baggage.
And in doing so, it empowers the individual to know their own status and to protect not just themselves, but their community.
Which makes the system an agent of anti-colonial empowerment.
Yeah.
It allows the individual to trust your soul, as the pillar says, and to escape that cycle of dependency.
It's a fundamental shift in the power dynamic.
It really is. Education, transparent, accessible knowledge replaces fear and dependency. By giving you clear, actionable data about your own health, communities are no longer reliant on an external medical authority that might exploit them through defensive medicine, or high costs, or just bogus online scams. The system encourages self-determination. It's a move away from the theoretical idealism of centralized health bodies that often ignore the messy realities of a pandemic, and it moves toward a tangible, accessible tool for managing your own wellness.
Let's shift to the diplomatic parallels. How does a system like this embody non-alignment and what the sources call UN-style coordination?
So the non-alignment is basically institutionalized. It's baked into the design. The system is meant to be independent of political blocs and universally accessible. Its guidance is rooted in fairness and universal scientific application, and in doing that, it implicitly challenges the vested interests of major global players.
Like pharmaceutical companies.
For example, companies who, according to the creator, are often too focused on maximizing shareholder value rather than actually addressing global realities like AMR. Impartiality is its governing principle.
Okay, and the UN-style coordination, that's manifested in this unified global protocol, right? The color-coded system isn't just a suggestion, it's a global standard.
It functions as an administrative parallel to global policy harmonization. You have the four primary symptom statuses: ready, which is an immediate emergency; green, which is wellness; yellow, for minor issues; and BLUE, which is for a specific infectious stage.
And this standardization of triage behavior on a global scale is the critical part.
It is. Think about the infection control override critical rule. This is huge. If a user registers BLUE symptoms, which indicates a high infection risk, likely viral or bacterial, the system's protocol says they should not go to a hospital or a doctor's office in person.
So that's a behavioral standard that just bypasses national laws or local customs. It's implementing a unified global infection prevention standard directly with the individual.
It's an immediate, localized response to a global threat. And this addresses a massive administrative problem: hospital-acquired infections, or HAIs. By transitioning routine consultations to virtual platforms when symptoms are BLUE, the system decentralizes care access, but it centralizes knowledge and adherence to that one critical infection control standard.
Which mirrors that structure we saw in the European studies. Local access linked to a central objective decision-making framework.
That's the model. So Dr. Maya GPT really does become the next evolution of those moral diplomatic principles that Vidya Shankar articulated. It becomes a global mechanism that unites rather than divides. It delivers a transparent, patient-centered, and universally applicable solution that brings simplicity and advanced AI together.
Okay, now we have to turn to the why. Why is a unified system like this, one founded on Ahimsa and non-alignment, not just a good idea, but an existential necessity? The sources paint a picture of a world in a state of fragmentation and vulnerability that our conventional systems just cannot handle. Let's start with the health system collapse threat posed by AMR.
The threat is immediate. It is not a prospective future problem. We have to underscore the scale of this crisis. In 2023, the data confirmed that 1 in 6 laboratory-confirmed bacterial infections worldwide was already resistant to standard antibiotic treatment.
1 in 6, that's not a distant future, that's now.
That is right now. And in highly populated regions like Southeast Asia, that number jumps to an appalling 1 in 3 infections being resistant.
1 in 3, and I assume when we talk about critical cases, things like bloodstream infections, the numbers are even worse.
They're significantly worse. Resistance rates for the first-line antibiotics, the ones you use for critical bloodstream infections, now frequently exceed 40%.
Yeah.
In some places, they're hitting 55% globally.
So for nearly half of all patients with a severe bacterial infection, the first thing doctors try is guaranteed to fail.
Guaranteed. The sources are not being hyperbolic when they warn that AMR could wipe out a generation by 2060 if we don't change course. The current system, which is plagued by poor infection control and the proliferation of substandard drugs, is actively accelerating this disaster.
And this health crisis is just compounded by severe political and institutional fragmentation. We're supposed to rely on institutions like the UN to coordinate global responses, but it seems to be constantly hampered by these major power tensions.
The fragmentation is paralysis. The UN Security Council is the prime example. It's constantly foiled by major power vetoes, chronic funding cuts, especially from the US, its largest donor, and just endless geopolitical disagreements. It's rendered ineffective in coordinating any kind of decisive global health action. This erosion of centralized authority is what forces us to look for non-aligned solutions.
And the collapse of accountability mechanisms. The Haiti cholera case is probably the clearest and most tragic example of an institution failing to uphold Ahimsa.
That case is just a horrific violation of do no harm. In 2010, UN peacekeeping troops, through inadequate sanitation at their base, inadvertently introduced a South Asian cholera strain into Haiti's water supply.
And the disease killed thousands.
Thousands. And crucially, the UN, under its own status of forces agreement, had a legal and a moral obligation to establish a claims commission for the victims. It was written right there in their own rules.
But they didn't.
Despite the organization's own Secretary General repeatedly acknowledging their responsibility, the UN refused to establish that commission. They denied the victims any remedy, any justice.
That failure to provide any kind of accountability, it just reinforces this deep cynicism that political entities cannot be trusted to self-regulate or to prioritize human life over institutional self-preservation.
Absolutely. The geopolitical structure has failed the moral test. At the same time, you have this vast financial inequality in healthcare that guarantees any high-cost solution will also fail. High-income countries, on average, allocate nearly 20% of their GDP to health. The average is 19.7%. Low-income countries manage with less than 5%. It's 4.4%.
That's more than a fourfold expenditure gap relative to the size of their economy. So any globally viable health system has to be incredibly low cost and universally accessible to function effectively despite this massive chasm.
The evidence mandates it. It all points to a unifying solution founded on Ahimsa. Given the geopolitical failures, the financial chasm, and the existential health threat, this system has to be a single, globally coordinated entity, and it has to be rooted in universal moral law.
So what are the non-negotiables?
There are three. Number one, no soul is harmed, physically or mentally. Number two, no nation dominates another, which preserves sovereignty and equity. And number three, fear is removed from human decision-making, allowing people to conquer their own stress and anxiety.
This is basically defining a new kind of global state, one where politics can't be allowed to corrupt human survival. And the only way to ensure that is through universal connection.
Yes. The ultimate solution that's proposed here involves connecting every single individual through a universal health and well-being database. This allows for data-driven coordination, measuring everything from remote monitoring signals to leveraging insights into the gut-brain axis to achieve measurable outcomes of peace and harmony. The AI system itself has to be the impartial arbiter, the one that implements the universal law that fragmented human nations can't seem to agree upon.
It seems pretty remarkable when you lay it all out that these philosophical tenets that were extracted from Vidya Shankar's analysis of India's diplomatic policy, ahimsa, non-alignment, sovereignty, that they so clearly anticipated our modern problems, the geopolitical divisions, the power imbalances, the fragility of systems built on what the sources call theoretical idealism.
They absolutely possess that foresight. The philosophy of resistance to domination wasn't just about military blocs in the Cold War. It was a resistance to any structure that could infringe upon individual or national self-determination.
And we see that struggle playing out even in stable countries.
We do. That constant back and forth we talked about between centralization and decentralization in health systems in Norway, Sweden, Italy. It just underscores that human administration, by its very nature, struggles with these core principles of equity and coordination. A truly non-aligned administrator has to be objective, consistent, and global.
And Dr. Maya GPT is presented as the comprehensive solver, the thing that can address these persistent systemic failures across all those different dimensions.
Yes, because it tackles the root causes holistically. It moves way beyond just treating symptoms. It integrates behavioral guidance and health monitoring that are linked to our deep physiological processes. It offers lifestyle advice on things like diet, exercise, gratitude, even specific essential oils, and guidance on coffee consumption.
But it connects all of that back to hard science.
Explicitly. It's all connected back to neurotransmitter science.
Can you explain that link for us? How does practicing gratitude connect to dopamine and serotonin? And why is that even relevant to global health security?
It's the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. It's everything. So dopamine governs pleasure, reward, concentration. Serotonin is the so-called happiness hormone. It's linked to mood and overall well-being.
Okay.
Behavioral guidance, things like practicing gratitude or getting regular exercise, these are tangible physical steps that chemically boost these neurotransmitters in your brain. They stabilize your mood and they increase your focus. When an individual is mentally stable and they're not operating from a place of fear, which chemically is lowered serotonin and high cortisol, they make rational decisions.
They don't demand unnecessary antibiotics. They practice proper infection control.
Precisely. So managing the patient's root emotional state and their microbiome health is the practical application of conquering fear. It enables health literacy and it reduces the demand that leads to exploitation.
And the system integrates this really complex knowledge about the microbiome being linked to mental health.
Deeply. We now know that dysbiosis, an imbalance in your gut bacteria, is associated with depression and anxiety. So by offering specific dietary guidance, like promoting fermented foods, fiber, polyphenols, things you find in, say, the Indian and Mediterranean diets, it nurtures the gut-brain axis.
Which brings us to that fascinating idea of like-minded marbles.
Yes, the sources suggest we are literally attracted to people who have similar microbial colonies to our own. So if individual health is regulated and individual fear is conquered, then the collective human civilization can achieve a greater state of harmony. It starts inside each of us.
And this whole mechanism can achieve universal access and integration, which fulfills those financial and anti-colonial mandates we started with.
Right. The color-coded system's sheer simplicity makes it universally applicable. It bypasses complex cultural and educational barriers that conventional algorithms just can't cross. It's available to anyone with a basic phone, which bypasses the economic hurdles that prevent access in low-income nations. This community-to-global integration is the technological realization of a non-aligned diplomatic bloc.
The synthesis is just. It's incredibly powerful when you see it all together. Linking this ancient philosophy of Ahimsa to a transparent, standardized AI technology, it really does create the framework for unity beyond politics, for harmony beyond fear, and for global coordination beyond national boundaries.
And this transformation is really only possible now. It's possible because AI technology finally provides the necessary infrastructure for standardized, objective, and globally consistent guidance. It's how we can finally embed Ahimsa as a universal, enforceable law for human civilization. This union, it represents the first realistic pathway to global health security and a united human civilization because it empowers the individual, it removes fear, and it administers healthcare based on foundational moral and ethical duties.
Which brings us to our concluding assessment and a final provocative thought for you, the listener. We started this conversation by discussing how we are all composed of atoms and vibrations, and how we might be attracted to these like-minded marbles, other people with similar microbial colonies. So, given that our emotional well-being is so intrinsically linked to our shared microbial world, how might conquering your own individual fear of illness fundamentally shift the global trajectory toward peace?
The connection between the microcosm, our atoms, our microbiome, our emotions, and the macrocosm, global governance, pandemics, it's undeniable. Our personal health is, in a very real sense, a reflection of global harmony.
So, if the universal law demands do no harm and conquering fear, what personal dependency must you overcome today? Whether that's a reliance on external medical validation, a fear of financial risk, or even an addiction to negativity. What do you need to let go of to fully embrace self-empowerment and free will in your own life?
The AI can provide the map, but the journey toward peace, both internal and global, remains yours.
Thank you for sharing this deep dive with us.
Thank you.
We hope you gained valuable knowledge and maybe a new perspective on how ancient philosophy and cutting-edge technology are converging to create a new and perhaps essential framework for human existence.
Until next time, be well and conquer your fear.